We begin tonight on the tarmac in Washington, D.C. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett boarding his flight back to Israel following his first official meeting as Prime Minister with President Joe Biden. And Bennett describing the weekend talks as warm and effective.
בין הנשיא ביידן לביני נוצר קשר ישיר ואישי, קשר שמושתת על אמון. אנחנו השגנו את כל המטרות שהצבנו לביקור ואף מעבר לכך. סיכמנו עם האמריקאים על עבודה אסטרטגית משותפת לבלימת המרוץ האיראני לגרעין. אנחנו עשינו צעד משמעותי בהצטיידות ובבניין הכוח הישראלי.
But while Bennett leaving the States with a feeling of accomplishment, Iranian leadership stepping further and further away from a negotiated settlement. Ayatollah Khamenei saying that at least from his perspective, Presidents Biden and Trump are two sides of the same coin.
هم هیچ فرقی با دولت قبلی نداره. یعنی همین چیزی که الان اینا در زمینه مسائل هسته‌ای مطالبه میکنن از ایران همون چیزی است که ترامپ مطالبه میکرد که اون روز مسئولین بالای دولتی میگفتن که امکان نداره، عاقلانه نیست و فلان. امروز اینا همون رو میخوان، هیچ تفاوتی نکرد. او با یه زبان میگفت، اینا با یه زبان دیگه.
Now joining me to discuss is columnist from Newsweek and editor of HistoryCentral.com, Marc Schulman, and Professor Mark Meirowitz from the New York Maritime College at SUNY. Thank you both so much for being with us. Now, I'm going to start with you, Mark Schulman. Let's start with Israel-U.S. relations. Bennett famously stating that he wanted to reset Israeli ties with the United States. But do you think that this has happened?
Up to an extent, absolutely. I mean, just the fact that it wasn't Prime Minister Netanyahu, or that former Prime Minister Netanyahu, that was enough to reset things. Obviously, Netanyahu's relationship with the Democratic Party was very problematic. And just by the fact that it was somebody else, that was a reset in and of itself. Obviously, Bennett's English is just as good as Netanyahu, so he was a good face for America. So to that extent, he certainly has reset it. He's also developed a dialogue directly with President Biden, which is always important to have that personal connection. So in the general sense, he's reset it. I mean, what does that mean in terms of actual policy? It means a little bit. It could mean a lot in time of crisis. We'll have to see how that develops.
So, Professor Meirowitz, I want to turn to you as well now with a follow-up on this, because Washington Post columnist Henry Olsen writes that no matter what, the United States-Israel relationship will likely sour under Biden and Bennett due to their diametrically opposing viewpoints. How do you respond?
It's the Washington Post. My point being that I would say that it's a pause button. What is that? I looked in the newspapers today to see news on Israel, particularly Israel strikes in Gaza, and there's nothing. All the news is Hurricane Ida and also Afghanistan. So in a way, there was good news and bad news. The good news was, in a sense, it's not good really, that there were these tragedies in Afghanistan for Israel, and then this was the focus. If you saw Biden, he was very subdued. It was a very good meeting, very good optics. So I think that it is unclear whether there's going to be a reset, because I don't know if America has enough political capital or Biden has enough political juice to do resets on this. I think they worked up some good interim agreements. Biden didn't mention the Abraham Accords, but talked about Israel's relations with the Muslim states. They didn't pursue very much on the Palestinian issue. And on Iran, Prime Minister Bennett got his points across. To me, the future is uncertain after Afghanistan. We don't know what's going to happen in China with Taiwan, in Iran with nuclear. These are the great questions. But Israel got a lot of good things out of this, and that was the fact that the Iron Dome is going to be funded. Israeli strength is, and the connection between Israel and the United States, Biden said it a number of times, is absolutely rock solid. So I think if I were Bennett, I would be, cautiously optimistic, but concerned about the state of the world and American foreign policy going forward, and the extent to which America will be able to focus its attention on, obviously, what's coming in Iran in particular on that issue.
All right, back to you, Mark Schulman. Moving on to Bennett and Biden's new approach to Iran. Bennett is saying that the approach has two main goals. The first, to stop and roll back Iran's regional aggressions, and the second, to permanently keep Iran from nuclear weapons. Biden, in the meantime, is telling Bennett that while preferred, if diplomacy fails, we've got other options. How much time is left to close a deal before Iran's breakout? How close to these other options are we?
Okay, how close to the other breakout is not at all clear. Defense Minister Gantz talked about 2 months to have the material to make a bomb, but then between having the material to making a bomb and actually having a bomb, there could be 1 or 2 years beyond that. So we don't really know what their intentions are. So that's number one. It's hard to make that assumption. Look, the fact that the United States left JCPOA was a disaster because there was no follow-up. There was no plan B in case Iran didn't fold, and Iran didn't fold. And so we're stuck in the situation where Iran has made a lot of progress since the U.S. pulled out of JCPOA. Israel has delayed it by various means. How much cooperation they're getting from the United States until now is unclear. I'm sure they'll be getting more cooperation going forward as it becomes clear that I don't think the Iranians want a deal in the end. Look, we have to go all the way back in history, all the way back to 2016. Why did Obama rush to make a deal? He rushed to make a deal because some of the sanctions were running out, and the Chinese and Russians said they were not going to sign on to extend them. So we needed a deal. Right now, the Chinese and Russians are working closely with the Iranians. So whatever leverage the United States has is limited because it does not have the support of the Russians and the Chinese. So we need to understand that. It's up to Israel to find ways of delaying the Iranians as much as possible. With American help, that would be great. I don't expect a direct Israeli attack on the Iranians because that's very, very problematic. But I think Israel will get support from the United States for whatever covert action it takes. Now, Biden would prefer an agreement. But, Biden's only one side of the negotiations, and the Iranians, I don't think, want the agreement in any case. So we'll have to see where that goes.
So, Professor Meirowitz, what do you suspect these other options include? We've heard talk of maybe allowing Israel to continue, sort of covert actions against Iran's nuclear development, but it's doubtful that the United States, for example, would deploy any ground forces to fight Iran. And Bennett also said that he would never ask the United States to outsource forces. So again, could you maybe go into what the other options might look like?
Well, I wouldn't really know what they are because they're all secret. But let me say from the geopolitical point of view that I can do some forecasting. First of all, Iran is also distracted in Afghanistan. So is Russia and China. The whole region has been upended by Afghanistan. You really have to look at this, and that will influence the United States thinking on this. So the question is, if Israel takes an action, will the United States react, and what way will they react? Now, if you look at the JCPOA, as my distinguished colleague has pointed out, historically it was a failure. Now, notwithstanding that, the United States has pursued this agreement so far as sitting in another hotel and letting the group sit with Iran and let China be the interlocutor and come tell you at the hotel what they discussed is a shame and humiliation for a world power like the United States to have to negotiate like this. And frankly, you heard the Ayatollah. Listen carefully, Mr. Biden, the Ayatollah. He says, Biden, Trump, you're all the same, and I don't want to deal with you, and I'm the boss. And so they don't want to make a deal. So question is, what does the United States do? Ground forces? That's out of the question. You look again at Afghanistan. Letting Israel have leeway on these issues? I would surmise, I haven't the slightest idea, I don't know, but I'm surmise that Israel is going to take action as it has in the past in concert with the United States, certainly on the covert side. So there'll be more leeway for Israel. I think that we saw that in the meeting between Bennett and Biden, a very cordial meeting, but also very, very, let's say, open in terms of what Bennett was saying. I don't think Biden contradicted him at all. So I think that the optics were good on this issue. Israel will have, I believe, much more leeway because the United States is distracted. And as I would argue, Iran, Russia, China, they're all distracted by what's going on in Afghanistan. That collapse is not just for American foreign policy, but it will impact Iran. The Shiites in Afghanistan are being massacred by the Taliban. There's just the whole region is in a complete turmoil. So at the end of the day, I'm going to be cautiously optimistic that Israel will be able to take the necessary action, and maybe Iran will be cautious in terms of what it's going to do going forward in light of all of the confusion that is engendered here in Afghanistan.
All right, Professor Mark Meirowitz, Marc Schulman, thank you both so much for speaking with us today.
Pleasure.